Hello, everyone. I'm John Stomberg, the Virginia Rice Kelsey 1961 Director of Dartmouth's Hood Museum of Art. Thank you for joining us. I'm honored to be talking today with Dr. George Shackelford, a Dartmouth 77 and the Senior Deputy Director of the Kimbell Art Museum in Fort Worth, Texas. So, turning to the subject at hand, Impressionism. Today, it is both a well-known and popular style, but it wasn't always so. So, how should we start this overview of Impressionism?
Well, I've already started us on that road with this wonderful painting by Edouard Manet from the National Gallery of Art in Washington. It's called The Railway, and it shows a woman and a child sitting in a garden, but they're overlooking the railroad tracks that's down in the lower level of the painting. The girl is holding her hands onto the bars of the fence. Don't miss the sleeping puppy in the lap of the woman who is maybe her mother, maybe her sister, maybe her a friend or a nanny. And this painting, amongst the works by Manet, really is about the whole world of the modern, his fascination with the modern world and with things like actually turning the ugly train tracks of the Gare Saint-Lazare in Paris into a fit subject for painting. Now, this is an extraordinarily famous painting by Manet from a big museum that people go to all the time. But one of the things that John and I wanted to talk to everyone about is how many great masterpieces there are in smaller museums all across America. And for me, one of the great examples of that is this portrait of Manet's friend and sister-in-law, Berthe Morisot. It's called Repose, and it's at the Rhode Island School of Design Museum in Providence. Sometime if you're driving from New York to Boston or on your way up to a meeting in Hanover, you should take a moment to get off the road in Providence and see RISD, which is just an extraordinary collection, and this one of their great masterworks.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, George. That's fantastic. And one of the takeaways that I'm getting from what you just said is that there's a lot going on in Impressionism beyond the idea, and it was derogatory at first, of mere impressions. So as we turn to Monet, perhaps the best known of the painters we'll discuss today, could you share with us some of the meanings that the painter evokes in his work? I understand that the significance of place may be lost on many of us today, so perhaps you could comment on that angle as well.
Certainly. This painting, which is maybe one of the most famous paintings by Monet in America, belongs to the Met in New York. It's the Terrace at Saint Adresse, or Garden at Saint Adresse. And it shows his father in a hat seated at the lower edge of the painting, his aunt under the umbrella, and two friends, perhaps his brother, perhaps her daughter, that are over by the fence looking down the cliff and out onto the sea. And for most people, this reads, first of all, simply as a view of a garden, a beautiful garden by the sea. But people in the era of Impressionism in the 1860s, when this painting was first exhibited, would have been perhaps a bit puzzled to see the attention that Monet is giving to the life of the harbor. This painting is at Saint Adresse, which is part of Honfleur, the great port where the Seine enters into the English Channel. And all along that part of the channel, there's a lot of traffic, and that's what Monet is painting in the background. The prow of the fishing boat with the black sail just barely touches the umbrella of the woman. It's sort of a contrast between the relatively poor fisherman and the relatively affluent young woman. In the background, there are ships both with sails and with steam. And Monet wants you to remember that this scene is taking place in modern times. I don't think there's an artist for whom questions of place are more definitive than Monet, maybe Van Gogh, but also we can chart the the stages of Monet's life by the places where he lived. And again, in our paintings you shouldn't miss that are in a less well-known museum, this is a masterpiece by Monet from 1870 that's at the Currier Gallery of Art in Manchester, New Hampshire. It was one of the great standouts of a show I did a few years ago about the early work of Monet. It's the bridge at the town of Bougival. And Bougival is on the Seine, not too far as the crow flies from Paris, but quite a ways down the meandering path of the river. It's at Bougival, and in fact, if we were standing by this bridge now, we're on a little island, and at the other side of the island, back behind us, would be the Grenouillère, which was a riverside amusement location. You could have beer and something to eat. You could rent a canoe. You could go boating. You could go swimming. And it was a place that was very, very much a sort of modern site. And see here Monet at the left and Renoir at the right, setting their easels up side by side to paint this same location. It was a location where if you were an extremely elegant lady, you would certainly not be seen. And so there's a sort of social commentary going on here as well that is lost on us now in the 21st century, but would have absolutely been understood by anyone in Monet and Renoir's time. The whole notion of these little towns along the River Seine is something that you could follow in the history of Impressionism. It really ranges from Paris all the way out to Giverny. But one of the stops along the way is Bougival, and here we find Alfred Sisley, great friend of Monet and Renoir. They sometimes shared a studio together in their youthful years, and here it is. Here Sisley is showing a steamboat going up and down the Seine in the town of Bougival just a few years later.
Thank you, George. That's really it's so easy to lose track of how important those specific places were and how they would have read to a contemporary audience, because this was very much contemporary art. And the times really matter. These were painters of a modern age. And there's a distinction between modernism, an approach to art, and modernity, an era of rapid change that included social changes such as urbanism and industrialism, mass production, and the introduction of electricity. So could you please discuss a little bit, in addition to the importance of place, how the times were important? And then, of course, let's not lose the importance of place, because Paris has always had a special place in the heart of Dartmouth alumni.
Yeah, absolutely. It's one of the best places for Dartmouth learning outside Dartmouth. And I bring up this amazing painting, one of the most famous Impressionist paintings in America, by Gustave Caillebotte. Caillebotte's an artist that is much less well known today, in spite of our efforts at doing exhibitions about his work and including his work in group exhibitions. But this is a painting that you'd be surprised how many people know. We did a Caillebotte exhibition in 2015, and I could verbally describe this painting to someone who, like the car valet at downtown Fort Worth. I said to her, "Do you know a painting from the Impressionist period? It's in a town. It's raining, and a man and woman in old-fashioned clothes are walking towards us under an umbrella." And she said, "Oh, of course I know that. I saw it in Chicago." And so this painting is so memorable, but nobody really remembers who it's by. Caillebotte joined the Impressionists in 1876. This painting was exhibited by them in 1877. At the same time that Monet was exhibiting his paintings of the Gare Saint-Lazare, which is literally behind us as we're standing looking into this square in Paris. Everything about it is up to date. The buildings have all been built within the last 10 years. It's really showing a neighborhood that was absolutely 100% new. The streets are newly paved, the buildings are newly built, the cafes and the bakeries and such are put in their places. And it's hard to see here, but on the building that faces us just at the left, you can read the words pharmacy. And it's hard to imagine, but there's still a pharmacy in that building nowadays, as is proved by this photograph of me with my colleagues and friends, Dee Dee Granzow Simpson and Robin Gosnell. Here we were recreating the Kayabat actually on this very place, the Place of St. Petersburg in Paris. And there behind us, the green awning is actually on a pharmacy. Kayabat was interested in the modern world just as we were photographing what happened to this part of Paris over the course of about 125 or 50 years. And he's absolutely fascinated by the sort of triumph of urbanism. But even when we look at him in a more rural location, he's commenting in a way, sort of slyly perhaps, on issues that matter to him and to his group. Here, even though he's painting his own brother and his cousin, they're in the garden of the house that Kayabat's grandfather bought outside, about 40 miles outside Paris, in a town called Hyères. And you can, in fact, visit this house nowadays. And I think he's very slyly commenting on just how bourgeois he is, just how much a figure of comfort and his position in society allowed him to continue to paint without selling a work of art. Just almost no sales of his art during his lifetime. He was a collector as well, and in fact, the Kayabat bequest in the 1890s to the state of France is the nucleus from which the present Musée d'Orsay evolved. He's one of the Impressionists who weren't there at the very beginning of Impressionism, and I think we've got another image which addresses that as well. Although Bert Morisot was in fact in on the very first Impressionist exhibition.
Yeah, it's fascinating to me that Impressionism was one of the first major schools, if you will, of art to promote women within their ranks and really celebrate them and include them as full members. Could you share some examples of these works? And maybe also, because we were talking about paintings in America as a leitmotif and throughout this discussion, bring up Cassatt's role in proselytizing for Impressionism in the United States.
Oh, absolutely. So we've seen Bert Morisot's portrait by Manet earlier in this show, and here is what I think is the best painting she ever painted. It's at the Art Institute of Chicago also, and it's the woman at her toilette, sometimes called the dressing table. We see this woman who is, I'm guessing, in the process of getting dressed rather than getting undressed. And she's got a standing mirror next to her. Bert Morisot signs the painting on the lower frame of the mirror. She's got a table set up nearby with some roses and maybe a sort of peony, perhaps made out of silk, perhaps natural. And she's in the process of preparing herself. Behind her, that magnificent sort of sort of jumble of whites, blues, grays, and reds is actually the bed in her bedroom. So we're really transported by this very well-mannered, again, a very, very bourgeois woman, Bert Morisot, into a scene of great intimacy, where she's bringing us right into the intimate world of one of her models. She's not as well represented as she should be, in part because, once again, she was a person of wealth and did not need to sell her works. So The greatest ones were for many years still in her family. They've been sold off from time to time since. But an artist who was absolutely concerned with selling her work. Uh, in fact, she was an extraordinarily savvy artist on a commercial sense, was Mary Cassatt. And Mary Cassatt joined the group at the invitation of Degas, whom she had met, and who became her very great friend. And she exhibited this painting with the Impressionists. Much fun was made of the way the tea set in the foreground was painted. And the painting, by the way, and the tea set belong to the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. And you can see painting and silver side by side in the galleries there. It's a painting, again, about a kind of bourgeois domesticity. A woman is, with her hat on, is visiting another woman who is hatless and gloveless. And so she's at home. The other woman has come in from the outside. Tea is being served. The absolute sort of incredibly bold move of painting the woman's face with the teacup half obliterating it. There's something so real about it, so cleanly observed, and also sort of absurd. And I think that's the daringness that Mary Cassatt had in her compositions of this period. But she's best known, in fact, for paintings like this one, her maternities, mother and child. And this is a great, great painting by her that's in Wichita, Kansas, a place where many people don't regularly visit. It truly is one of the great paintings by Mary Cassatt in an American museum. But more than her own paintings, Mary Cassatt was extraordinarily important for the dissemination of Impressionist works across America. She became very good friends with a woman from New York named Louisine Havermeyer, who went on to found with her husband one of the great, great, great American collections of Impressionism, perhaps the greatest. She promoted the work of Degas, of Manet, her own work, of course, and the works of Monet and Pissarro and Sisley as well. And she was, her brother was a collector, and she herself could afford to buy things from time to time. But it's her role as a person who brought Impressionism to America that can't really be overestimated. She was extraordinarily important, and of course, her great friend was Degas.
Yeah, so that is amazing, and her relationships cemented the collections in the United States for many of the major cities that we recognize Impressionism as having a foothold in. But when we turn to Degas, we seem to be turning towards something from the future of art. When we look at Degas, it's as though we're looking at paintings from the 1920s almost. He seems super talented, comfortable working in lithography and sculpture, drawing, pastel, and painting. But he's also very forward-looking, introducing compositions that are really, truly radical for that moment. So could you please talk a little bit about what Degas brought to the table and his contribution to modern art, and have we fully assessed that contribution?
We've certainly been trying to assess it over the years. I did a show about Degas 35 years ago, and just recently, about 8 years ago, did another one. He's my home artist, if you will, for all intents and purposes. And this shot is taken at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It shows one of the some 24 bronze casts of his wax sculpture of a little 14-year-old dancer, flanked by paintings that Mary Cassatt was absolutely instrumental in bringing to New York, one at the left from the Bingham collection and the other at the right from the Havermeyer collection. And surely Degas is known above all for his dancing pictures, and this is one of the great ones. This is one that came to the Met. It's been in New York since it was painted, basically, but it came to the Met within the last 20 years. It's one of his most complicated ballet subjects with everything that we want it to have to express the kind of modern uh, modern attitude that you're referencing. Um, First of all, the influence of Japanese art is very strong here, with this very forced perspective, an unnatural perspective that tends to go back and forth between flatness and depth. Then there is the insistence on gesture and modern gesture, with the ballet dancers either adjusting their costumes, actually performing a dance move. The girl at the center with a pink bow is actually doing a movement for her teacher, who's standing at the right with a staff. But in the background, the girls are just resting. They're scratching their necks or keeping their feet on point, and they're attended by their mothers or sisters, who are the women in shawls and bonnets in the background, who are there almost as chaperones to their younger daughters who are getting instruction at the Paris Ballet School. This insistence on modern subjects and subjects that were not only modern but contemporary and pertinent to the audience that Degas was trying to reach is I think very, very important for why he seems so not only of his time but in a way kind of timeless. The subject that I think is the maybe the most important for that is his great treatments of the female nude. And the nudes by Degas can be found in both museums, large and small. You can get them in Chicago or at the Metropolitan, in Philadelphia, in Washington. Notably, they are absent from the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston. That Boston not being much of a town for nudity.
Yep.
But not so far away is a museum that I think many people will never have heard of. It's called Hill Stead. And here it is, the house that was built by Theodate Pope and her father, who hired Stanford White to build them a colonial revival house in the manor of Mount Vernon. And the house is now open as an art museum. You can visit it, and it has truly one of the most beautiful collections of Impressionist painting in America. Not very big, but really fine. And for me, the great masterpiece there is this Bather by Degas. I think this may be one of the top 10 works by Degas in America. And yet I would wager that 99 out of 100 people who are listening to us tonight have not actually seen it in person. It's a pastel. It was probably shown when he did a show of nudes in 1886. We see a woman bending over to gather water into a sponge. She's taking a sponge bath in a tub. The flat metal, probably zinc, shallow tub. It looks kind of like a pan for paella. And she's standing in it because she doesn't have to have that much water. She can just have a pitcher of water and take a bath standing there. But she's like a ballet dancer in Degas. I mean, she's like a great dancer by Degas, reaching down to do a kind of bow at the end of a performance. And it is so filled with Degas' mastery of light, the light coming in from the window that has a curtain sort of diffusing it, but running across the carpeted floor, this brightly patterned carpet, then being interrupted by the patch of a towel lying on the ground, ready for her to step on it. That white contrasting with the bright color of the carpet and the blue of the drapery, and then with the overall blueness of the background, then setting the figure off as this kind of golden body, where the highlights are in a kind of beautiful, soft yellow, gold. The shadows are all ranges of from some kind of dark purpley brown into pinks and the sort of reflections that are in the shadows, and then that extraordinary head of red hair that is so beautifully rendered. The back of her neck sort of tied up in a knot so that her hair won't fall down as she's taking a bath. It's tender, it's incredibly modern, and yet it is also, I think, completely timeless. And that's the great achievement of Degas when he's at his best, is that sense of being of his time and forever as well.
Thank you, George. An amazing trip, a journey through a stunning image, and as you said, very under recognized image. I love too that you've brought in the subject of these major collectors who built collections. Many of them are now public, and as we turn toward Renoir, we can think of an artist who is perhaps the most popular with American collectors during his lifetime. His work was collected by all the American major collectors, and in a way, to be a major collector, one had to have a Renoir. It was sort of went both ways.
It's true. And here we have Duncan Phillips and his wife Marjorie, the founders of the Phillips Collection in Washington, which was, interestingly enough, for the times that we are living in, it was founded as a memorial gallery to his father and brother, who had died in the pandemic, so-called Spanish flu in 1918. And Phillips opened his home and their collection to the public to memorialize them at that time. But it was later that he acquired what is, without doubt, the greatest painting by Renoir in America, maybe the greatest painting by Renoir, period. The Luncheon of the Boating Party, a painting from the early 1880s, famous the world over as the kind of image of conviviality and collegiality amongst good friends. And it's a painting that you have to go to the Phillips Collection to see. So among the works of Renoir that are in America, this is one that is going to be staying at home all the time. So when you're in Washington, go to see it. It's worth the trip. It's the only Renoir at the Phillips Collection, which often has works 2 and 3 deep by the major painters of this time. But with this Renoir, I think Duncan Phillips said, "I've got the greatest. Why do I need a second one? Why would I get a second one?" But the other great collector of Renoir in America was Sterling Clark, who with his wife Francine put together an amazing collection that's now in Williamstown, Massachusetts, not officially part of Williams College, but in the same town, and working very closely with Williams College, not only at the undergraduate, but also at the graduate level. Sterling Clark didn't like Renoir after 1890. He was absolutely uninterested in the late works of Renoir. And in the show of Renoir's nudes that I did with the Clark just a year ago or so, there was a painting from Chicago that Clark had absolutely rejected and had written on the back of a photograph of it, "Fat, fat, fat, nothing but fat." And it was his sort of not very body positive reaction to the physical type of late Renoir, which tends to be, or in fact is most gloriously abundant, large, powerful in scale and form. I was tempted to ask to put this painting by Renoir into the exhibition of his nudes. It's a painting that's at the Clark, and that's where the exhibition was being held. So we could have simply slipped it in, unbeknownst to the director. But we knew that it was a painting that is obviously not a figure painting. It's a still life. But it was painted during the same trip when he immortalized his future wife, Aline Charigot, as the blonde bather. The paintings were painted within weeks of each other. And the onions, it strikes me, are treated with the same tenderness that he that he used when he approached painting his lover. The kind of the silky, pearly quality of the onions is almost, well, it's incredibly sensual, and it's verges on being sexual. I think it's one of the great under-known paintings by Renoir in America. And if I told you that one of my favorite Renoirs was a painting of a pile of onions, I think you'd think I was crazy.
Right.
Yeah.
Terrific. So before we move along in our story and leave the original form of Impressionism behind, we really need to acknowledge one other major figure in the background of Impressionism and modernism and even modernity, and that's Camille Pissarro. He was, to me, the Impressionist's impressionist. Could you please share some thoughts on why Pissarro was so revered by his fellow artists?
It's absolutely true. And from the time when they first really encountered each other at the end of the 1860s and the beginning of the 1870s, Pissarro was one of the great friends to all. He's a bit older than most of the Impressionists. He's closer to Manet in age than he is to Monet, for instance. But he casts his lot with this younger group of artists and is a very faithful exhibitor at all of the Impressionist exhibitions over the course of their 8 exhibitions taking place over the course of 14 years. 12 years. But he was, he's an artist whose paintings are extraordinarily fine and beautiful. But when we were talking about what painting by Pissarro we should show, it was hard to put our finger on one painting that was really representative of him. So I've brought together 3 paintings, again, from museums that people may not visit all that often, though they should. And the first one is one of his greatest early paintings, a still life from the Toledo Museum of Art, where curator Larry Nichols from the class of 76 at Dartmouth has just done an exhibition around this painting and other still lives of the 1860 by Bazille and Manet as well. A beautiful project that's simply a show of about 5 paintings. Really terrific. So this is Pissarro early in his career. This is Pissarro at the height of his early experiments with Impressionism, when he, Monet, Sisley, and to some extent Renoir were taking their canvases out into the landscape and insisting on painting from the actual motif in its presence, the impressions, the sensations that it gives him, and trying to bring those ocular sensations into their realization in oil paint on the surface of a piece of cloth. I think this is one of the most beautiful Pissarros I know, and it's in a museum that many, many people won't have visited, the Memphis Brooks Museum of Art in Memphis, Tennessee, of course. And it shows the town of Pontoise, where he was living in the 1870s, the distinctive tower of the church there, you see it right. But he's on a little pathway. It's not even a street, high up on the hill atop this kind of vertiginous slope going down to the town. There are fields off to his left, and the town and the distant landscape into the background. But notice how even in something that seems to be really completely a painting of the countryside, notice how he insists on the fact that it is 1872. And that is showing the smokestack that's billowing out smoke, early pollution in the Paris region. Some kind of energy is being expended. Some kind of industry is happening there in Pontoise, and I think he's commenting very subtly on the fact that the suburbs are becoming more and more industrialized. Argenteuil, where Monet lived for many years, is now, there's nothing left of the garden city that it was when he lived there in the 1870s. Barely a building survives, and it is almost unrecognizable. Pontoise, by contrast, is still a place where, like the Place in Paris, you can go and see many of the motifs that Pizarro painted when he was living there. His fascination with the agricultural life is really unique within the Impressionist group. And Pizarro's subject matter often tended towards painting uh, his his fellow citizens of Pontoise or later Éragny, not too far from Giverny, where he lived and from which he could visit his friend Monet down in Giverny. And here in the 1880s, the very late 1880s, Pizarro has picked up on the modern style of Seurat, the pointillism that was uh, introduced by Seurat at the Impressionist exhibition of 1886, the last of the shows, where his Grand Jatte, the most famous painting of the Sunday in the Park with George painting by Seurat, was exhibited for the first time. And here, Pizarro is leaving the sort of parks of Paris behind and going out into the country and showing uh, a man and three women harvesting apples. The man is taking a large pole and shaking the tree so that the apples will fall to the ground to be picked up by his friends below. This is a painting at the Dallas Museum of Art, which has a superb group of Impressionist works. And it's in the early days of Impressionism that Pizarro is also working very closely with his friend Cézanne.
Yes, this is a perfect painting to leave the 19th century from as we turn to Cézanne. As we cross the dividing line between the 19th and the 20th centuries, few artists' careers demonstrate as clearly the major lurch that art went through as it modernized at the turn of the century. So as we turn from Pissarro to Cézanne, could you walk us through how Cézanne changed representation and also brought about some of the knock-on effects of those changes in the art world?
Many people think of Cézanne only as a post-impressionist. They think of the Cézanne as he was reimagined by Picasso and Braque in the early years of the 20th century. But we have to go back to his own moment and see him in the context of what was happening right around him when he was painting. So when Pizarro is painting that landscape in the field at Éragny in 1888, Cézanne is down in Aix-en-Provence, where he was from, and living in the house that he had grown up in, and painting in the environs of that house and the environs of the town, but painting with an attitude that really wasn't so different from the one that Pizarro was adapting or adopting and making great strides with in the 1870s. Namely, the idea of trying to go in front of the motif, being present in the garden, painting these chestnut trees with their bare limbs that screen us from the view of the Montagne Sainte-Victoire in the background, the great subject of Cézanne's late landscapes. But his idea was to try to look at nature without the framework of our knowledge of what we are actually seeing, and to attempt to paint a tree not as the bark-covered tree that we know and that we could draw from memory, but instead to see it as a pattern of gray and olive patches, to see it literally as a sort of a physical manifestation on the canvas of things that he's seeing in the distance, and not to differentiate as much between what his notion of a tree was and what he actually saw. And this is something that Cézanne writes about. He says, we must see the structure in nature. And as he progresses in time, this painting from the 1880s is a not so far in time, but in a way, a lifetime away from his great bathers, a painting that is almost certainly painted entirely from the imagination, and one of the great masterworks of his last years as an artist. This one of the most famous paintings by Cézanne in the world and at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. Just an extraordinary piece. And this is the kind of painting where the body of his models, the bodies of his models are created in, as he would like to say, cylinders, cones, and spheres. This is the preparation for Cubism that Picasso and Braque really needed when they first saw Cézanne in the early 1900s.
So now we're there. We've crossed this century marker. We're at the turn of the century. We're into the 20th century. And you have illustrated that so clearly for us with those two works by Cézanne. Now, as we look back at those changes at the turn of the century, it's tempting to divide the world of European modern art into two camps. Notwithstanding some exceptions, there were artists whose work would largely be understood through their drawings, such as Picasso's Cubism, and others for whom color was absolutely essential, such as Matisse's Expressionism. If we see the Picasso side evolving out of Cézanne, is it fair to look to the late Monet for the Expressionism side? How would you describe this period in the great master's life and his ongoing role in the art of the later 20th century?
It's a fascinating subject, and it oddly enough has a lot to do with the story of the history of art as told to us by the Museum of Modern Art in New York, and where the notion that Cézanne was the founding artist of modern art was really promulgated by Alfred Barr, who was the famous director of MoMA in those years. But around 1950, Barr saw and began to be fascinated by the work of Monet, and Monet, of course, had leapt into the 20th century with a great exhibition in 1909 of his water lilies. Here's a perfect example from the MFA in Boston, a show that he called Landscapes of Water, Paysage d'eau, which was a phenomenal success. The show nearly sold out, and many, many paintings coming to America at that point. But what was unknown in this stage, and not really known until the post-war period, was the very late work of Monet. Paintings like this one from the Cleveland Museum of Art, and it was Barr and a few other connoisseurs in America at this time who began to appreciate these very large-scale paintings by Monet. This one is about 6.5 feet tall by about 14 feet wide. So it's really a vast painting. And it was big on the scale of the artists in New York who were painting abstract pictures in the post-war era, and for whom the sense of filling the canvas equally across space with motifs and with color and with brushstrokes, the notion of this sort of field of painting was particularly interesting. And most of those artists had never seen any of these works by Monet. They don't really connect to the history of their evolution. But Barr saw works like this as a kind of justification for an ancestry for the modern art that he was so interested in promoting in New York in those years. And so the passion for late Monet spread in America. And in the 1950s, 3 museums in America acquired works by Monet. The Cleveland Museum of Art was one. The St. Louis Art Museum was another. And in Kansas City, Missouri, the Nelson Atkins Museum of Art was the third. These paintings were bought individually by these museums over the course of not a very long period of time from dealers in Paris who had exclusive access to the estate of Monet. And Barr bought first one painting. It burned in a fire. He bought a second triptych and a third long single painting measuring about 20 feet in length. And these paintings became then the what we know of as the late works of Monet. And they are, in fact, extraordinary. We were lucky enough to have the St. Louis canvas at the Kimbell in the summer of 2019 for an exhibition, Monet, the Late Years, that I put together. And what's fascinating, of course, is that these three paintings in sort of Midwestern museums, Cleveland, St. Louis, and Kansas City, are all part of a triptych. And they were reassembled at those three museums and then again at the Royal Academy of Arts in London not too long ago, each museum agreeing to lend its painting to the other two. And here's where you get a sensation of what the late work of Monet was about and how it feels to us now to be extraordinarily modern. Just after he died, however, art had bypassed Monet, and his water lilies, the big grouping of the water lilies that we see and so much admire in Paris now, was thought of as a bit old hat when it opened in the 1920s. But it's really in the post-World War II generation that I think we have an appreciation for this great accomplishment. And it's interesting. Barnett Newman, the most severe and minimalist of all of the abstract expressionists, wrote a letter to Alfred Barr at the time of the acquisition of the first works by Monet by MoMA to say, I'm so glad you bought a work by Monet because there's more about modern art than just Cézanne.
Well, thank you, George. Before we turn it over to questions, I just want to say how much we appreciate you sharing your time and your thoughts with us and giving us a glimpse into the great Impressionist paintings that lie in surprising places across the country. Certainly when this is all over, we'll look forward to getting in the car again and going around and making our pilgrimages to places like Kansas City, Springfield, Massachusetts, and so forth. So thank you very much for all of this.